As Russian, Chinese and Central Asian leaders meet in Beijing to discuss regional security, including the future of Afghanistan, we ask, are Russia and China looking to build a new NATO of the East? Can they overcome their past differences to create a united front to offset the US's influence? And what does it mean for global security? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. China and Russia hailing what they say is a new era of strong cooperation. Its symbol, the Shanghai Cooperation Summit taking place in Beijing. The one-time rivals have pledged to strengthen their cooperation on foreign policy and to provide a different approach in resolving the world's crises. They've worked together to block United Nations Security Council resolutions against Syria, arguing against any type of foreign military intervention whose aim, they say, is ultimately regime change. At this Beijing summit, one of their top priorities will be finding a common approach to Afghanistan. The Afghan leader Hamid Karzai has been invited to attend the meeting. Here's Steve Chow with a closer look.
In the battle over influence, the latest pawn in the game of two re-emerging powers arrives in Beijing. The Afghan leader Hamid Karzai has come to secure guarantees of support post-NATO, post-US, and China and Russia have offered to step in. Given a warm welcome, it's the first time for an Afghan leader to attend a summit designed as a counterweight to Western influence in the region. This year, Beijing plays host.
China, being the second largest economy in the world and a rapidly advancing country in the world, and luckily, very, very luckily, being a neighbor of Afghanistan, is high on our agenda in relationships.
In trying to rebuild their sphere of influence, Russian and Chinese leaders created the Summit of Central Asian Nations in 2001. Since then, the two have often walked in lockstep, especially on foreign policy issues like Syria. As other nations accused President Bashar al-Assad's government of mass human rights violations, the two Eastern powers blocked UN security resolutions to condemn the acts. They have also blocked US-led resolutions on sanctions against Iran over its alleged nuclear weapons program.
We will strengthen our strategic cooperation on international issues, work together for the good of both our countries, and safeguard the peace, stability, and security of the region.
Traditional Cold War rivals, the two have had their disagreements, especially over China's stealing of Russian designs of its military hardware. But China, the largest consumer of energy in the world, is eager to complete a deal to buy 70 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia. And Russia is eager to increase trade with the world's second largest economy. What began as a summit involving a handful of nations has evolved into a more powerful bloc, with India and Pakistan signaling their interest in becoming official members. It's little surprise then at the renewed confidence in the words and actions of Russian and Chinese leaders. Whether it's international conflicts or border disputes over territories in the Pacific, both countries have shown an eagerness in charting their path, separate from traditional Western powers. Steve Chow for Inside Story, Hong Kong.
Let's quickly take a look at the setting for all of this. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was created by China in 2001 to increase free trade and mainly address security issues around its borders. Its members are China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, with India, Mongolia and Pakistan, as well as Iran, as observer states. The bloc has a total population of 1.5 billion. The region accounts for 11% of the world's proven oil reserves. So are Russia and China looking to build a new NATO of the East? To answer this question, we're joined by our guest in Hong Kong, Joseph Cheng, Professor of Political Science at City University in Hong Kong. In Washington, D.C., Ariel Cohen, a Senior Research Fellow at the think tank The Heritage Foundation. And in Moscow, Pavel Felkenhauer, a defense analyst and columnist at the Novaya Gazeta newspaper. Welcome to you all. In Moscow first, Pavel Felkenhauer, when we look at the Chinese-Russian relationship, undoubtedly a relationship that has had its ups and downs through the years, certainly looks better today than it did many years ago. But what would you say is the level of trust and maturity that this relationship has reached?
Well, I would say it's rather mature strategic partnership, wide-ranging in many fields. Trust, well, there is some trust, though there's maybe some problems there in some areas. Though it's indeed very different than it was not only in the Cold War, but actually in the 90s, some 15 years ago, when the Russian military are still believing that China is a terrible threat, an imminent threat. And Russian politicians were also harping on that. The Russian present policy with China that I would describe as containment through engagement was, the architect is the President Vladimir Putin. I would very much agree that it's a very pragmatic policy of having better and better relations with China and solving all the territorial outstanding issues and fully demarking the border and sort of getting closer to China and ironing out major differences while China is not as strong as it may be, say, in 10 years' time. So yes, there is some suspicion, some apprehension, maybe a Chinese very rapidly growing geopolitical and military might. But Russia tries to be as close to China as possible and cooperate in different fields, though not in all fields it's really working out fully well.
All right, let's look at the Chinese perspective. Professor Chang, would you say that there are today much fewer hurdles than they were certainly in the 1950s and the 1960s, when there was that very real rift that took place between the Soviet Union and Communist China, obviously pitting two communist systems, a rift that was very ideologically driven, that no longer appears to be the case, obviously. So just how significant are these hurdles then?
I agree. I do not believe that ideological factors are now very significant factors in the relationship. In fact, as you can see, when both countries normalized state-to-state as well as party-to-party relations in 1989, relations have been pretty good since then. The basic foundation for a good relationship is that both countries understand that they would like to retain major power status, and they certainly would not like to see a unipolar world. They would like to promote multipolarity, and therefore they need each other because, after all, the European Union and Japan are too close to the United States. There is a reasonable level of tolerance for differences. For example, when the George Bush administration, by the turn of the century, tried to cultivate Russia, tried to cultivate the Putin administration at that time through persuasion of Moscow accepting the abandonment of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. China kept fairly quiet about this, and there are differences, as our Russian friend has said, concerning, say, natural gas prices, oil prices, and so on, as well as complaints on the part of Russia that China tried to steal Russian military technology and then sell its armaments to third world countries at cheaper prices, etc. But there seems to be a maturity in that both sides understand that there are difficulties in the relationship. They are ready to tolerate these differences. They are ready to patch up these differences and continue to bargain hard while they understand the basic strategic considerations on both sides.
So despite the ongoing differences, Professor Chen, if I could perhaps bring in Ariel Cohen to take a look at the United States perspective on this, what would you say is Washington's look at this increasingly assertive Russian and Chinese influence in the world and this increasingly close cooperation despite the lingering differences between the two countries? How nervous does it make some in Washington to see this?
I think the Obama administration is missing this major geopolitical development. They are currently focusing on the elections, on the presidential elections. They tried and failed to have the reset policy with Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. That failed. And it is not a NATO-style alliance yet because NATO was the United States' unquestionable leader, and Russia and China are more or less equal in terms of nuclear power. Russia is stronger in terms of economic power. China is stronger. But it is emerging now with Ahmadinejad present at these summits. This is the second or the third time that he is present at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. With Ahmadinejad, it emerges as an anti-American alliance. They will also have a huge challenge in Afghanistan when the United States pulls out the troops, and they're directly challenging Washington on such issues as Syria, effectively preventing a humanitarian intervention in Syria, which probably is not such a bad development, as well as providing a cover for Iranian nuclear weapons program by stopping effective sanctions at the United Nations. So de facto, it's anti-American.
Let me ask Felgenhauer in Moscow, is this essentially an anti-American alliance? And are these two countries justified in trying to deepen the relationship between them because they essentially feel encircled by the United States policy, its growing influence in the world, and frankly don't subscribe to some of its foreign policies when you look at the way the United States wants to perhaps tackle the issues surrounding the conflicts in Syria, the issue of Iran and so on. Russia and China take a very different perspective, don't they? Does much of this stem from the fact that they felt tricked when it came to Libya, that they went along with the United Nations Security Council resolutions imposing a no-fly zone under the guise of protecting civilians, only to find that it very quickly morphed into regime change? Is that what it is essentially about for Russia and China?
Well, indeed, Russian and Chinese diplomats and foreign ministries are very closely coordinating on Syria in the United Nations. That's so. A couple of times jointly used veto and threatened to do so in the future if there's any kind of sanctions against the Assad regime. There is cooperation and coordination in other fields, but I would not describe the Russian-Chinese partnership as an anti-American alliance. It's not an alliance at all. It's a partnership in some fields and some disagreement maybe in others. So maybe some in Moscow someday thought that we should sort of working with China will balance the United States. To some extent that may be happening, but it's not alliance at all. There's joint interest in Middle East. There's, of course, joint interest, say, in keeping stability in former Soviet Central Asia. That's the Shanghai Organization was built for that. Russia would want to expand the Shanghai Organization. Russia was actually would maybe want to see Iran acceding, maybe talk about maybe India and Pakistan. Also with the idea of balancing to some extent Chinese influence.
But that may be going further than what China wants to do. And so, Professor Chang, do you feel that Russia and China are not looking exactly at doing things with a common underlying strategy? Do the Russians want to take this a step further in creating a security organization when China would like to see it more as a regional organization focused on energy and trade, essentially, and not military security issues?
Well, I agree with my Russian colleague that this is not an anti-American alliance. It is a strategic partnership. And they made it very clear that this is not an alliance. It is not directed at any third country. I think basically they are interested in bringing about a multipolar power configuration in the international community. In fact, to China and probably to Moscow, their relationship with the United States are more important than the Sino-Russian bilateral relationship. This is certainly true for China, and for Russia, probably its relationship with EU, its relationship with the United States are probably at least as equal equally important. And on various fronts, you see that China also cooperates with the United States. For example, in the case of the Six Power talks on the Korean Peninsula, and basically China understands it is much weaker than the United States, and it always, at the moment, avoids antagonizing and provoking the United States. It is important for China to maintain a cordial relationship with the United States.
Ariel Cohen, you say you disagree, but would you say that this is a logical evolution of history, though, that these two powerful Asian countries would be looking at ways to deepen their ties, to exert their influence in a way to repel the United States from what they regard as their backyard in the end?
Well, as far as the Chinese relationship with the United States, I think the jury is out. The United States and China have a tremendous economic relationship, and the Chinese, at least at this point, do not want to endanger and jeopardize it by a military confrontation. The United States, as we know, is shifting its military deployments around the world to Asia, to the Pacific. The Chinese may interpret it as aimed at containment. I hope not. But with Russia, it's different. Russia today is ruled by the elite that views the United States as a root of all evil. You have tremendous anti-US propaganda. You have support of anti-American regimes in Iran and Syria. So for Russia, the priority is to checkmate and challenge the United States that they see as declining because of our irresponsible financial policies, because of our national debt of equal or greater than the GDP, and our budget deficits. In terms of the European relationship that the colleagues mentioned, yes, it is very important for Russia to keep the European Union countries in cooperation and as a market for Russian raw materials. But the European Union bureaucracy itself often challenges the United States, dislikes NATO, and dislikes the United States because they have their own project. Not a very successful project at the moment, but they have a separate identity than the United States. And the Russian policy is also aimed at splitting the United States from the European Union.
Pavel Felkenhauer, when we look at Russian policy, Chinese policy, the prospect of the two countries working closer together in an area like Central Asia, in Afghanistan, is it only logical that a country like China, which shares a border with Afghanistan, would want to play a bigger role in the construction of that region along with Russia?
Well, there is the Shanghai Organization. Its core mission is to keep the stability in Central Asia. Actually, no one, including the West and the United States, wants Central Asian authoritarian but secular regimes to fall victim of some kind of Islamist revolutions. So keeping the peace there, it's a mission for the Shanghai Organization. Though at the same time, of course, Russia to some extent may be a bit apprehensive of Chinese influence getting too big in this area. Also, China is pressing right now the idea of a free trade organization, a free trade zone there. Russia is building its own economic union with Kazakhstan, Belarus, and wants to expand it maybe to other Central Asian republics, its own free trade zone, and Chinese competition may be seen as a bit detrimental. So there are close relations. There's a very important thing to keep the Central Asia peace. But expanding that mission to something, I mean, fighting American influence worldwide, that's something that no one in China at least wants to see. Also say there are problems, say Russia and Vietnam have joint gas and oil exploration in the South China Sea, in the waters that China considers its own. So there are some kind of problems between China and Russia, but these problems are surmountable in the framework of this partnership. That
so as you say, a few divergent
does not want to become an
interests.
anti-American treaty.
A few divergent interests in the areas, but a lot at stake for both countries. And we know that China as well has many of its firms already operating in Afghanistan. Professor Chang, it's very significant, isn't it, as a region for the Chinese as well, to have a foothold in. Can Russia and China, though, create that kind of entity? Can they build this common vision that goes beyond the lofty political goals in order to achieve something in common in Afghanistan, along with the other members that may join this SCO grouping?
It is a trial and error kind of process. For example, you just mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It initially started as a kind of strategic organization with emphasis on maintaining border tranquility and to combat extremism, religious fundamentalism, Splitism, and so on. But then gradually, various countries managed to seize the initiative to develop economic cooperation. It was actually a regional organization, the very first regional organization initiated by China, but China has been careful to respect Russian interests in the region and within the organization. And meanwhile, you see that there are also many circles of cooperation, excluding China. Russia maintains its collective security organization with various former Soviet republics. It also has its own ideas about strengthening the Commonwealth of Independent States and so on. But then with mutual accommodation, I think there is a reasonable chance to work out a cooperation base. At the same time, of course, Central Asian countries and perhaps Afghanistan, they are also interested in diversification of the diplomatic relations. In fact, various Central Asian states have made such an attempt, but of course they have been deterred by the danger of the so-called color revolutions. But it is still in their interest to seek diversification so as to reduce their heavy dependence on China and Russia.
I think that for now, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a mechanism to resolve ongoing problems. And on the economic level, Russia is increasingly becoming something it did not want to become, which is a raw materials appendage of China. Russian energy is fueling the Chinese growth. But in the long term, I think there will be competition in Central Asia. China is perfectly happy for Russia now to pay for the security by building up the collective treaty security, the collective treaty organization, the security organization dominated by Russia.
But let's not forget that Russia's role isn't just limited to that Shanghai Cooperation Organization that we're talking about. Pavel Felkenhauer, Russia clearly in the last few years, I should say, has positioned itself as the leader, or at least as the co-leader of the Southern Hemisphere, forming along with China and others, the BRICS grouping, which among themselves, these 5 countries that account for the BRICS, account for 3 billion people in the world. So that's half the world's population. Do you think that that grouping, essentially, with China and Russia leading it, could form that much-needed counterbalance, many would say, to the US's hegemony in world politics?
Well, the BRICS countries, of course, are very rapidly economically growing powers that will, and of course, economic power somewhere down the road creates also political and military power. But on the other side of it, this group unites nations that have rather diverse interests. I mean, Brazil is not interested in Eurasian power politics whatsoever. India is actually, militarily speaking, the main adversary of China right now. and is building up, actually with Russian help, a military that believes its main mission is countering the possible threat coming from China and Pakistan. So I don't believe that the BRICS countries are anywhere near turning into a kind of bloc of nations that could actually politically and militarily counter anyone. They're too diverse.
Obviously much potential to build on, but still lingering differences. We'll have to leave it here, I'm afraid. But I should thank all three of my guests. In Hong Kong, Professor Joseph Cheng; in Washington, Ariel Cohn; and in Moscow, Pavel Felkenhauer. And thank you very much indeed for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your feedback as always. Just email us your thoughts at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.